I have to say, with over 25 years of experience leading transformational change initiatives for large global organizations, the term disruption is not new to me, and nor is the supply chain, the global supply chain, new to me. So, but today, supply chain has really become a household name, and people are familiar with supply chain more than ever before. And that's mainly because it's been in the news and in the news every day. And so consumers have this natural burning desire to have an understanding of why they can't get their desired purchases, and how and when it's going to be resolved, which is a question that all of us would like answered. So, but all of that news has truly exposed really the magnitude of the challenges that we're all facing today. So, how about you, Jess? What are you hearing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Very much the same, Patricia. And, I come from a similar background. I spent 25 years also in industry, mostly in inventory management, running the day-to-day operations at several global retailers, moving inventory around the globe, source to market in all directions. And, I remember the typhoon that sank a ship on which we had many containers. I remember factory fires. I remember port strikes. But yeah, as painful as all of those things were, I don't think any of that really compares to what we're seeing now. And certainly, my friends and family really didn't have any visibility to that in those kind of one-off events of the past. And now clearly everything is front and center. Everything is in our daily kind of mindset today, whether you're in business, in retail, or any other industry, or consumers, or how many kids are screaming at you, I want my Legos. So it's definitely different. And I think we see industry coming around to that. Sure.
Yeah, so true. So the need for supply chain resilience really has never been more prevalent than it is today. And yes, supply chain disruption, it is all over the news, and more people are learning, like Jess just talked about, family referring to the supply chain. And I mean, it's really like when you think about the awareness of it, and consumers that are just trying to understand the root cause of what's behind all of these challenges that are happening, and those not just from consumers all the way to the C-suite that are joining meetings and getting intimately involved in the discussions surrounding operational challenges that ordinarily would be handled by the operational leads as opposed to the C-suite. And so whether or not that's, looking at supply planning, whether it's inventory or merchandise management, whether it's order management, logistics, you name it, this seems to be much bigger. It's a bigger disruption than we've ever experienced before. And if you look at the left-hand side of the page here, yes, we've all experienced some level of supply chain disruption in our lives. And that was even before the recent, product shortages or significant delays that we've been experiencing over the past 20 months. But these disruptions that are shown here on the left, they're events that happened and they were managed, resolved within a time period, and the business operations, went back to what their new business as usual was. So when you think about, here, this did happen during the Ever Given ship. We know of that vessel getting stuck in the Suez Canal. Well, sure, that was a challenge that required the ship to be, dug out, and it was probably within a week's time back to some level of normalcy. And then you look at, there's labor strikes. Well, yes, they've happened and they've been dealt with. And you look at, mergers and acquisitions. And mergers and acquisitions, they are a disruption to a business. And you think about the disruption is that new acquired business, or even divesting a business, spinning something off. It will be a disruption in the sense that until that business operations is integrated into your business models, or even if the decision is made to not integrate and just operate as a separate entity, but have maybe some consolidated reporting for that matter. Those are disruptions that are point in time. And then you can look at, for those of you that remember, way back, you have Y2K. We all remember the year-long buildup anticipating disruption that was going to hit January 1st, 2000, the millennial. So here it was, Time magazine literally has the cover page saying it's the end of the world. And so that really turned out to be a non-event. And now you look at, compare that to what's on the right side of the page. And, I would say you look at COVID, and I'd be pretty hard pressed to really call the context of the coronavirus and the worldwide impacts a mere disruption. However, honing in on the supply chain specifically, well, yes, the pandemic has shocked every aspect of the global supply chain. And then there's weather events. And you'll look at, while weather events, we used to deal with some occasional hurricanes, or, you could have 3 inches of rain. That's an extreme weather. That was an extreme weather. And hurricanes are natural disasters. Well, we seem to be entering into a more frequent cycle of extreme weather and natural disasters. And then you now look at also, you have here, you see an alarming rise in ransomware and the shift to supply chain attacks. And then let's not forget, Lori spoke of it earlier. We hear it every day, news banners. It's the truck and driver shortage, 80,000, at the number of 80,000. And so, yes, the US has been grappling with a chronic truck driver shortage for years, but the pandemic has put that into crisis level mode. And the impact affects the entire economy. It's almost a staggering number. It's almost 70% of all freight is moved through US highways. So the broad impacts call for a reset. Jess is going to talk more about how retailers are managing through these significant challenges and expand on the distinction between these two.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. And so yeah, I mean, to repeat a little bit of what Patricia just talked through, but also to expand on a little bit, I do believe that companies are smart to consider what's happening today in the context of something larger than disruption, like she said. If we take a closer look, these 4 largest trends that we see really represent systemic threats. And I think that's the key differentiation we're calling out, the fact that what we've experienced in the past probably haven't been as many systemic threats to business as normal. And so these are threats to supply chain efficiency and effectiveness. And we see that the business context today is anything but stable. But of course, the pandemic has been the biggest driver and accelerator for a wide range of impacts. But those have come on trends that have been in place well before the pandemic, like Patricia said. So if we kind of follow this 4-box slide here in the upper left, we've got the pandemic. But remember, we had the trade conflicts and escalating tariffs. These are fueled by rising nationalism globally, which have increased the cost of global trade and driven shifts in sourcing strategies across a wide range of industries. So you've got the context of that in when it comes to the labor and the shortages of truckers. It's not limited to that, obviously. So well before the pandemic, there were threats to any notion of an abundant supply of labor at predictable and generally low costs. And those threats have surfaced from an aging workforce, notably in logistics, of course, as we read day to day, demands for a rise in wages and working conditions translate to rising costs in the supply chain. And the foundation for what we now call the Great Resignation was already afoot even before the pandemic lent its weight to accelerate these trends. And so we see a large shift in the workforce, moving from one opportunity to the next as new, better opportunities come available to people. So that's affecting a wide range, far beyond just the trucking industry, but certainly that's the flashpoint right now. Patricia mentioned the ransomware. So the reality is these are increasing with the advent really of an entire new industry. Ransomware as a service. It is a thing. It is rising. I don't think anyone truly knows the full extent of a lot of the ransomware attacks. We know those that are reported. We know those that are dealt with and become public, but certainly that is not all. The question is, how much of the iceberg are we seeing there? And the issue here is that while some companies, may consider themselves safe, and I think that might be faulty logic to begin with, but the reality is partners to their supply chain are all vulnerable, and each one potentially represents that proverbial weak link in the chain. These attacks are growing rapidly, and they're not going to subside. Again, a systemic threat. And finally, the climate and sustainability concerns are hitting companies both at their back door and the front door, if you think about it. So extreme weather events have shown how vulnerable the global supply chains are to events in far reaches of the globe. And companies, certainly insurance companies, are taking notice and signaling how the increased frequency of these events and the intensity of them are driving strategies to enable or require rapid resiliency in the wake of these events. That's what's happening in terms of the supply chain. But when we think about business overall, the effects of this are also at the front door. Younger generations are now the drivers of consumption, and their approach to brands is much more critical. They've got a more critical eye than their parents did towards the companies and the brands and how they're demonstrating the values of environment and sustainability. So, the prior slide, you had this image of the Ever Given stuck in the Suez Canal. As Patricia said, a week later, things were largely back to normal. But these threats we're seeing are systemic, meaning they're outside the control of any one company, no matter how large that company is, and they're largely here to stay, certainly when we think of them in terms of business cycles. So it's this agglomeration that really has us, pointing the finger at this, at being more than merely disruption, something that really warrants a reset. So the last point I thought I'd make here is that with these prolonged and broadening impacts of all this, it's forcing companies to discover and learn new ways of how to continue to bring goods to market amidst this loss of control and rising costs. And this is why I think the change that we'll see as companies navigate through this will be lasting change and reflect different operating practices. So if you go to the next slide, Patricia, here what I refer to as this inertia to lasting change. And right now, there's really no reliable end in sight to supply chain backlogs, to the shortages of silicone chips and truck drivers. There's no real antidote to stem the rising tide of ransomware as a service. So the point is, businesses cannot afford to wait this out, wait for the stuff to get unmoored, and those bent on succeeding can only adapt. And the way that happens when we see these big events is that there's a lot of immediate discovery coming out of the pain that people are experiencing. They discover new ways to get goods to market. They learn how those new ways operate, how they can fold into their operational practices, leads to obviously analysis and deciding the pros and cons, weighing the risks of these alternatives. And the winners will translate all that into decisions and ultimately drive for change in practices and policies, relationships with their suppliers and their entire sourcing matrix, and shift their indicators of success to ultimately adapt to the changes. So, and that is again a kind of a systemic response, and that's why I think we're going to see lasting change from this. People are discovering, companies are discovering new ways to do things. So, but let's not forget about the consumer in this and their experience. They're going through a similar journey. After all, this journey of supply chain is ultimately designed to satisfy the consumer's wants and needs. So, Patricia, what do you think consumers are thinking right now?
It's absolutely, you have here's some consumer sentiment that's really very prevalent to take a look at. When will it end, is the question. But listening to the consumers and seeing how they're changing their buying behaviors, you take a look at some of these statistics, and the consumers are looking at, you'll say 45% they never knew what a supply chain, even anything about the supply chain. Yet conversely, it can go over 91% will now make it part of their buying criteria. And this really touches on the change behaviors where they're, buying in bulk and ordering in advance, and more in-store shopping where they have the confidence, or maybe it's a false confidence, but they know what's on the shelf, they know what they can get and what they cannot get. They're not going to run the risk of having a delayed item come to them, delayed purchase. That's another pain point. And so now you'd look at that being said, 43% had missed the opportunity to give gifts for a special occasion because of the supply chain issues. And then conversely, you've got, or actually adding to that, you've got in anticipation, 28% of consumers, they're fearing that they're not going to be able to follow through with family traditions. And these are really very emotional ties. So they're rationing essential items, yes, especially for seasonal items, purchasing them in advance, doing everything they can from what's in their control to be able to prevent having disappointment at holiday times or special occasions, as those 2 points that I made. Then you've got here, you'll look at, there's 84% of consumers they'll say that the delays have caused them to cancel their orders. And then you've got 80% that will say the delays, if they have those delays, it'll actually force them to switch brands. So those are significant impacts that you look at. And then last but not least, you've got a lot of consumers that are saying they really expect their retailer to be able to provide them with those real-time insights, updates, status delivery, or even trade-offs like compensate, give me a discount because I've not had the item when I expected it. And so there's all sorts of thoughts and feedback that the consumers are pushing forward. And last but not least, obviously the delivery expectations have been so shattered that 92% believe that there is more supply chain disruptions to come, and that million-dollar question of when will it end is still, a black cloud hanging over their heads. But Jess, what do you see that the executives are feeling, and how are they responding to when will it end?
Yeah, well, certainly I think we can say that executives are also consumers. That they're asking the same thing, not just as a consumer, but obviously leaders of their organizations and their enterprise, and they want to know when it's going to end too. But when they look at the statistics that we see on these bubbles, so now from what executives are seeing, whether it's the increase in tariffs, which have gone up 3 times on a big chunk of goods from China since 2018, that the tariffs have tripled. when they look at the shortage of drivers. You mentioned like 80,000. I've seen the number here of 160,000. I've seen 230,000, all lasting anywhere from 5 to 10 years. CEOs report that the workforce shortages are impacting corporate strategy, that 50% of the CEOs see that extreme weather events are changing it. So again, we're seeing all that, they're seeing that, but I think really as everyone rolls up their sleeves in industry, it's less about when will it end and more so the reality of how can I adapt. And that is the voice we're going to hear in these next slides after this one. But it's kind of summarized here in the sense that how to respond to these changing dynamics and challenges is about agility and resiliency. It's about supply chain visibility, improved visibility in order to empower that piece we saw in the last slide a minute ago of discovery, learning, analytics, and decisions. Can't do that without improved visibility and real-time visibility to know where your goods are. Preparing for greater collaboration. We're going to talk about in a minute this dynamic of control versus collaboration with partners. And I think that is one of the key elements over the near and long term that companies are talking about navigating. How do they balance those two? They can't do it entirely alone. Yeah, we hear these stories about the big box retailers, taking upon themselves to charter their own ships and move freight differently. But unless you're a big box player, it's always going to be, and even for them, it's going to be a combination of taking control where you can, but preparing for more collaboration in the long term. And then lastly, expanding and improving the risk management capabilities, applying those same risk management principles that are so well rooted within the realm of finance into supply chain more deeply than maybe it has in the past, and evaluating things with an eye to that risk. Now that we see the vulnerabilities and how easily supply chains are exposed. So I think that's where executives are headed, with that same level of exasperation, but yet with more ability to take action. So if we go to the next slide, we see this here detailed a little bit more and getting a little bit more granular. So agility in these top three boxes, how are people going to win through this reset? What we hear from industry leaders, from those covering the industry, and those that we talk to in our day-to-day experience with our retail customers, is that this notion of agility, where innovation in the supply chain becomes valued over standardization. A story yesterday about the notion that this new transcontinental highway in Mexico that's opened up in the last few years, combined with the numerous customs entries in South Texas, are starting to become thought of as a viable alternative for Mexico ports to become a viable alternative to LA Long Beach, because the LA Long Beach thing is not going to end anytime soon. So that's what, that type of innovation that's happening, the discovery and the learning and discussion around these new possibilities ultimately require the agility to adapt to that. So that's one point. The risk, where this is really kind of the notion of in this calculation, diversification becomes a way of guarding against risk of a highly consolidated sourcing model or supply chain being upended by a singular event. And so using that approach from a risk management standpoint to evaluate the pros and cons and the capabilities within a supply chain. But this other point that I mentioned previously about control, really where predictability is more important than savings. And so, we hear those stories again about the big box retailers charting their own ships to take control of their destiny with their goods, deciding which goods should move as a priority and where to move them to. So their contents are being transloaded onto boxcars and trains, or manufacturers are designing their own chips. Think about Apple and Tesla. So it's all around this notion of taking control. So at the high level, those concepts then are playing out through the business capabilities enabled by what we see in the orange panels. And these orange panels aren't designed here on this slide to line up vertically necessarily with each of those boxes at the top. It's really the breadth of what we're showing here, everything from supply chain on the right to human capital management in the center, over to more financial capabilities on the right. But those key approaches to navigate this reset translate to these functional capabilities in the back office. And some of the more important ones, like in a word, we could almost bring this down to planning. Now more than ever, the need to leverage the visibility into the supply chain and translate that into plans and dynamic plans, whether that is supply chain, workforce, or financial scenario modeling, are all critical. And they all rely on that real-time comprehensive visibility and analytics. So companies need these tools to enable the agility, manage risk, and gain control. They need proven providers for these, and from providers who themselves are investing in innovation, who have broad product offerings, so that when customers are ready to deploy new strategies, the applications are ready to be turned on in the cloud by their partner, not shopped for in haste through yet another RFP. So, but let's go to the next slide, because I think these make sense kind of conceptually, but when we think about hearing these words directly from industry leaders, from those who cover the industry, I think it's important to hear some of that. So, from agility and resiliency, we've only got a short cut here, but we've got 3 quick snippets that I think will help us hear this same language from those in industry. And I think let's hear what we have to say, what we hear the CEO of Target saying. I don't think we can hear the audio. You might want to stop the share, Patricia, and make sure your share has got the audio going. But what we'll hear here in a second is the CEO of Target, who has been navigating this along with everyone else over the last several months, talking about what has enabled them to navigate this more or less successfully, certainly not without their own hiccups, but with the key elements they think have been critical to their success.
So Jess,
Patricia, when you share your screen, the green button at the bottom, when you click that, you'll go all the way to the left and it says something like share computer audio, and you click that as well, and then we'll be able to hear the sound.
Yeah, share sound. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right.
Been managing this for over 20 months now.
And
it's
2022.
Click the agility screen.
So we've been living with this and managing this for over 20 months now.
It's a
And
highly
I think this is
well, the point here is that
scale matters. Having the expertise in place in sourcing, in supply chain, in logistics is really important.
Which companies have shown this
It's running too in
ability
the background,
Yeah.
so I apologize. I have to stop that. I'm going to do that one more time, guys.
Really recognize
you
this.
can just exit your slideshow and go back in. That's what I do.
Yeah. Yep.
I don't think anyone expects virtual conference to run it expressly seamless. No worries.
Yeah, we'll get it. So let's see. Now we're going to try this one more time. It's going to go.
Over 85% of participants do expect to spend more on technology in 2022. That might be a result of higher costs due to supply chain disruptions, plus the ongoing needs of the new post-pandemic workforce. got to invest in digital transformation. When asked how technology can help fix supply chain issues, executives supplied a range of ideas. One member suggesting improved end-to-end visibility, another suggesting less reliance on China.
Yeah, so before you click on the next one, Patricia, so I think he failed to say in the talk track there, the third bullet point of that image that we just saw that touched on the importance of managing risk within that. But again, we missed the CEO of Target talking about agility and resiliency, and I'll save everyone the path back to that video. But I think over the course of a 3-minute interview, he used those terms, agility and resiliency, probably 24 times. So critical piece that articulating by industry there. So let's hear the next one under control, where we've got an industry analyst talking.
Strategy of being aggressive on vertical integration, of slowly taking more and more control over the supply chain. Yes, these are outsourced to Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, but it's a highly exclusive deal. They have leverage over their suppliers. And this is where I think investors really need to look at which companies have shown this ability to vertically integrate their supply chains. Because in an era of supply chain disruption, it's those companies that are going to be able to weather these storms better than others. It's the ones that own, whether it's their manufacturing, their operations, their logistics, their relationships with their customers. They're going to definitely fare better than the companies that have outsourced everything.
So
would you like me to go back to the first one?
No, that's fine. I think we'll we've captured it on the prior slide, but again, these were industry executives talking about agility, talking about risk management, and bringing that framework into their supply chain. And again, here talking about taking control. But I think, when we think about what we've been talking about, control, yet at the same time diversification, I think this just highlights the challenge and kind of the needle that needs to be thread in terms of balancing these capabilities and the priorities right now. And again, I think that's where industry requires the tools to have the best visibility possible to make these decisions. So to kind of bring some of this conversation to a wrap in terms of what we've been seeing, if we go to the next slide, Patricia, I think back to my days in retail, fashion apparel in particular, and that industry went through its transformation. Probably about 20 years ago was probably that tipping point, and we saw this where there was winners and losers. The losers who did not make the shift to fast fashion. And so, it used to be the notion of stack it high, let it fly. Standardization and repetition were the name of the game to reduce costs and bring mass goods to market. But, the behemoths then followed that mantra, but they lost out and were beaten by the companies who had more immediate visibility to demand signals from customers. They had far greater agility in their design as well as their production. Point being, we're seeing a similar story today played out in a much larger scale across all industries. But again, the lessons are there. Again, agility and visibility are critical to success. So, but I think this also reminds us that the value chain is centered on bringing value to the consumer that meets their aspirational needs. And that what happens in the supply chain has a direct consequence on the customer experience. And I think that's one point that I think you've got some more to cover on, Patricia. That's right. And the winners certainly will have, the agility and control. So when you look at the value here, that's how retailers need to respond to this, right? Is just shared. The call to action is a supply chain reset, enabling agility, risk management, and control. And you could see in the infographic here and Dean shared this earlier, it really illustrates a progression of how value is created in the retail industry. And taking that transformative approach to supply chain management, it requires an understanding of each of these connection points
And that's starting with planning, whether it's inventory, order management, all the way through logistics. The value in agility and visibility is throughout. So even if you took planning as the example that we've been speaking about so much today, the broad scope of planning that is. So in addition to any supply chain planning, we've heard it. Jess just mentioned, Scott certainly talked about it. There's planning and budgeting, there's workforce planning, there's capital planning, integrated retail planning, or the sales and ops planning. And so as we know, it's retail, was mentioned, it's not been stable, right? But it's, as Scott mentioned, it's really taking a look at the strategic modeling capabilities and the predictive planning that really is allowing the executives to have the visibility to adapt with the speed that is necessary today. So supply chain can no longer be thought of in isolation. It's an integral part of the business, and it's a key enabler to exceeding customer expectations and achieving that customer lifetime value that every retailer is striving for. Now, Oracle has the complete suite of applications to help solve these retail problems. And so we welcome your calls, as we were mentioning in the prior session. Look forward to hearing from you and working with you and help solve some of these challenges you have. Now, in closing, it's just, it's a simple, clever little sketch here that is complemented by a very powerful quote, which change fixes the past and transformation creates the future. So, need to say no more, that it's the future that we're focused on. And that is, I'll go back to Jess's 3, operating with agility, managing risk, and a greater level of control. So thanks very much. And I think we'll open to questions now.
Yeah, let's open to questions. So if anybody has any questions for Patricia or Jess, please put them in the control bar at the bottom of the Zoom, screen. I think so much of what you said, one, this is a very, very powerful quote, and it took me reading it 3 times for it to really just kind of resonate. So thanks for sharing that. So much of what really the entire team said today is a lot of what the Argano Interrail team has kind of been reinforcing throughout the pandemic. And that is the need for that real-time visibility that you get through doing the strategic modeling, through doing, scenario planning, that the outcome needs to be, agility and resiliency. And I thought it was interesting, the concept of risk management through vertical integration, because that's something that has been, it's definitely been prevalent in previous times. So it's just, I think we're really powerful. So thank you both very much for sharing your insights today. If anybody on the call has any questions, please ask in the Q&A box. Okay, well, it looks like you've done such a thorough job addressing everything that nobody has any questions. So thank you both very much. Thank you, Dean, for participating and being a part of our day so far. And we will definitely be making these presentations, the recordings of these presentations, available on our